leader of this household. But don't tell your grandmother that, okay? Who was the leader of your household?
Mama.
Who was the leader of your elementary school? Didn't you go? You know what? Let me ask you a question. Is leadership more about the position or more about the person? Stephen Covey, the author of the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, once said, most people consider leadership as a position and therefore never really consider themselves as leaders. Is that true? Do you consider leadership as a position? Or would you agree it's more than a position? The real question I have for you today, where does leadership start for you? I want you to imagine just for a second that it's your first day at a new job. You walk in, they tell you to go meet your boss. You go into his office, you shake his hand, he tells you to sit down, and he says, I only have one question for you today. Are you ready to be a leader? Now you have no idea what you're going to be leading. How would that make you feel? What would you be thinking? What would you say? Because this is exactly what happened to me on my second assignment in the United States Navy. It was my very first day. I had my Navy whites on, I had my ribbons, and I had that nervous feeling where you feel like you have to vomit because I really didn't know what to expect. New states. So I walk in, and they said, in 5 minutes you have to meet your new boss. Now my new boss, his name was Chief Barron. He stood about 6'3". He was in the military for 21 years, had a bald head, real laid-back personality. So as I walked into his office, I immediately realized that everything was very organized. And as I walked closer, I could hear the birds chirping out of the window, and the office smelled like fresh flowers. As I took a seat, he looked at me and said, Petty Officer Casper, you have an outstanding record. You also have the highest academics among your peers. You're also the youngest person here. I only have one question for you today. Are you ready to be a leader? Now time out. I got to admit, the most people I've been in charge of at that point, at 21 years old, were 5. And they ran all over me. And that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was that they were all in kindergarten. So as I sat there in amazement for about 30 seconds, I felt pressure to say yes. Good, Petty Officer Casper. You're going to be taking over for Petty Officer Smith. She will be leaving in 2 weeks. And oh, by the way, she's in charge of 140 people. But I know you'll do a good job. I walked out of there like life kicked me in the stomach. I set myself up for failure. So what did I do? I made sure I got up early. I made sure I shadowed Petty Officer Smith for the next 2 weeks. And as I observed Petty Officer Smith, she made sure she kept everyone in line. No one liked her, but no one crossed her. And I immediately realized what I was going to be in charge of in the next 2 weeks. I was going to be in charge of 140 people from 4 a.m. to 4 p.m. If we fast forward 2 weeks, it was my first day on the job. It was 4 a.m. and 3 people were missing before we were going to march. I looked at my watch, it was 4:03, and Chief Barron comes into my ear and he says, Petty Officer Casper, there's 3 people missing. What are you going to do? So I immediately sprung up. What would Petty Officer Smith do? So I grabbed Seaman Torres and I told Seaman Torres to go find those 3 people. And as he went to go find those 3 people, we sat there at detention for over an hour. And at 5:05, we marched. I felt good about myself. I set the standard, I set an example. We're one team, we're one mission. I felt good about myself. At noon, Chief Barron called me into his office. I walked in there like a confident George Bush. Yes, Chief, Petty Officer Casper, I'm really impressed with your patience. I felt like I hit it out of the park my very first day. I couldn't wait for what he had to say. I just couldn't wait. Petty Officer Casper, that's exactly what Petty Officer Smith would have done. And that's exactly why she's not here anymore. I don't need another Petty Officer Smith here. That's why I put you here. The fastest way to disconnect from your team is to punish everyone for a few people's mistakes. Next time, take care of the people that are on time, deal with the problems later. I didn't walk out of there like George Bush, I'll tell you that. I felt like life kicked me in the stomach again, but I had to keep my head up. But over the course of 2 or 3 weeks, I started to realize my team started to disconnect from me. People started mouthing off. People stopped listening. People were late. People weren't doing what they needed to do. I needed to hold their hand. So after 5 weeks to the day I took that job, I had enough. I walked in the chief's office, shut the door. Chief, why did you put me in this position? I'm the youngest one here. No one listens to me. No one does what I say. I feel like I'm responsible for everyone here. And then he stopped me. He looked at me and said, Petty Officer Casper, that's the first good thing I've heard since you've been here. What do you mean, Chief? And then he walked over to his desk. And he got his name tag. I'd never seen it before. I never paid attention. He said, Petty Officer Casper, this is what leadership's all about. You see what it says? It says, I'm responsible. See, so many leaders, Petty Officer Casper, when things are going wrong, they don't take responsibility. They start pointing fingers. When people give them advice, what do? They get defensive. That's what leadership's all about. Your problems are your responsibility. Start taking responsibility. I walked out of there like a new man. I started to take responsibility that day and every day forward. And things started to fall into place. In my personal and professional life, from that point to this point today. So as you leave here, ladies and gentlemen, I ask you the same question I started with. Where does leadership start for you? Are you going to wait until you become an expert in your field? Are you going to wait until you become a manager or an executive? Are you going to wait until you get done those 15 goals in the next 10 years before you step up and become a leader? Because true leaders do not wait for things to happen. They take responsibility and make things happen. I'll leave you with one final point. As you continue your journey into leadership, you will encounter many problems. But the solution will always start with 2 words. I'm responsible. Mr. Toastmaster.